My brother and I were searching for a lost family cemetery, rumored to be up a forgotten fork of a West Virginia creek, a task left by our late grandmother. The GPS died almost immediately, and the paper map was useless in the tangled, steep terrain. As dusk fell, we realized we were hopelessly lost. The forest grew quiet, and that's when we saw the first one, a face, carved into the trunk of a massive beech tree. It was ancient, the features weathered and stretched into a wide, grotesque smile. We thought it was just a weird folk art, a curiosity. Then we saw another, and another. Every few trees had one, all with the same unnerving, smiling expression, watching our progress deeper into the gorge. Darkness fell completely, and we had to make camp. We couldn't find a flat spot without those smiling faces staring down from the trees. We finally huddled between the roots of a large oak, building a small fire. The light from the flames danced over the carvings, making the smiles seem to twitch and move. My brother, usually the stable one, started to unravel. "They're watching us, Ben," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously. "They weren't here before. We're going in circles." I told him to get a grip, that it was just pareidolia, our minds seeing patterns in the bark. But the sheer number of them felt intentional, like markers on a border we weren't supposed to cross. The whispers began around midnight, faint, sibilant sounds that woven through the rustle of leaves. We couldn't make out words, but the tone was mocking, gleeful. My brother jammed his hands over his ears. "Do you hear that? Stop saying you don't hear it," he screamed at me, his face a mask of terror. I did hear it. It was the sound of children giggling, but distorted, wrong. The fire suddenly died down to embers, as if suffocated, plunging us into near darkness. The smiling faces on the trees seemed to glow with a faint, phosphorescent light. My own mind was breaking. This couldn't be real. This was a shared hallucination, panic-induced hysteria. It had to be. A figure emerged from between two trees. It was short, childlike, but its movements were jerky, unnatural. Its face was a blank, pale oval. It stopped at the edge of our dead firelight, and then its features contorted, stretching into a perfect, horrifying replica of the smiles carved into the trees. It was a mockery of joy, an expression of pure malevolence. Another one appeared to its left, mimicking the smile. Then another. They began to circle us, their movements a series of sharp, twitching motions. My brother was hyperventilating, and I knew I had to get us out, or we'd die of sheer fright right there. I grabbed my brother's arm and ran, dragging him blindly through the pitch-black forest. We couldn't see the trees, but we could feel them, and I knew those carved smiles were watching us flee. The twig snapping and rustling sounds behind us weren't from footsteps. It was a dry, skittering sound, like many thin legs scuttling over leaf litter. We didn't stop. We fell down embankments, waded through icy creeks, and tore through thorny thickets. The skittering and the faint, gleeful giggles followed us for what felt like miles, until we finally burst out onto a logging road, the first hints of dawn graying the sky. We were found by a logger at first light, bloody, clothes torn to shreds, and babbling about smiling trees and laughing children. No one ever found our campsite or the trees with the carvings. My brother hasn't been the same since. He barely speaks and jumps at the slightest sound. I've spent years in therapy trying to process the event, to accept it as a shared traumatic hallucination. But the therapist can't explain the scratches on our backs, thin and precise, like thorns or tiny sharp fingers. Nor can she explain the faint, earthy smell of decay that lingered on our clothes for days, or the fact that I can never look at a smiling face now without feeling a cold, primitive dread seize my heart.
I sought solitude on the Appalachian Trail after a brutal divorce, thinking the physical exertion and isolation would cleanse my mind. I'd been hiking for 3 days deep into a remote section, seeing no one. The peace was exactly what I needed, until the whistling started. It was a tune, faint and distant, something familiar I couldn't quite place. It was cheerful, but in the vast empty wilderness, it felt deeply unnatural. I'd stop to listen, and it would stop. I'd hike on, and it would resume, always keeping the same distance behind me. I convinced myself it was another hiker, or a trick of the wind funneling through the rocky gaps, a simple auditory hallucination from fatigue. The second day of the whistling, my mental state began to deteriorate. The tune got closer, now clearly recognizable as an old folk song, "She'll Be Comin' Round the Mountain." The whistling was perfect, every note precise, but devoid of any human warmth. It felt like a recording or an imitation. I started hiking faster, my pulse racing. I'd shout, "Hello, is someone there?" The whistling would immediately cease, leaving a silence more threatening than the sound itself. I was sweating despite the cool mountain air, my thoughts spiraling into paranoia. Was I having a breakdown? Was this what a psychotic break felt like? Being haunted by a cheerful, invisible whistler? I decided to leave the trail and cut through a valley to a Forest Service road, desperate to reach some form of civilization. The whistling followed. Now it was coming from beside me, just off the path, hidden in the thick undergrowth. I caught glimpses of movement, a dark shape keeping pace with me. I started to run, my pack bouncing painfully on my back, my breath coming in ragged sobs. The whistling kept perfect time with my frantic pace, never faltering, never getting out of breath. It was hurting me. The cheerful tune became a soundtrack of pure terror, shredding my last vestiges of rational thought. I was no longer a man on a hike. I was prey. I broke into a small clearing where an old abandoned homestead stood, just a stone chimney and a collapsed roof. And there, standing in the center of the ruin, was a man, or something shaped like a man. He was dressed in outdated, tattered hiking gear, his back to me. The whistling was coming from him. It was loud and clear now, echoing off the stone. I stood frozen, terrified, but also strangely relieved to see a source. Then, the whistling stopped. The figure, slowly, mechanically, began to turn around. There was no face under his broad-brimmed hat, just a dark, shadowy void where his features should have been. I didn't wait. I turned and sprinted faster than I ever thought possible, crashing through brush and stumbling over roots. The whistling started again behind me, but it was different now. Sharp, angry, and piercingly loud, right in my ears, as if the thing was right on my heels. I felt a cold breath on my neck. I didn't look back. I found the road hours later, a 2-lane blacktop that felt like a miracle. I collapsed in the middle of it, weeping. A family in an RV found me. I said I was gibbering, my eyes wide with a fear they said they'd never forget. The doctors call it wilderness psychosis, but I know what I heard. I know what followed me. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear that faint, cheerful whistling, and my blood runs cold.
My grandfather's cabin was willed to me after his sudden passing, a secluded property deep in an Appalachian hollow he always told me to stay away from. I arrived to settle his affairs, the narrow dirt road nearly swallowed by untamed rhododendron and a canopy so thick it felt like perpetual twilight. The air was dead silent, not even bird song, just the oppressive weight of the mountains. The cabin itself was a time capsule of dust and shadows, smelling of old wood and damp earth. I told myself the unease was just grief, a psychological trick of the mind being completely alone for the first time. But as I stepped onto the creaking porch, I felt the distinct, primal sensation of being watched from the endless dark tree line. The first night, the sounds began. It started as a faint scratching at the door, like a dog wanting to be let in. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to logic my way through it. A possum, a branch scraping in the wind. But the scratching became a deliberate, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. Then it moved to the window beside the fireplace. I couldn't bring myself to look, curling into a ball on the old musty couch my breath held. Just before dawn, it stopped. In the morning, I found no tracks, no broken branches. Only long, faint scratches grooved into the thick, weathered wood around the door handle, too high for any animal I knew. By the third day, my sanity was fraying. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside sent jolts of pure adrenaline through me. I started seeing movement in my peripheral vision, a fleeting, pale shape darting between trees. I'd spin around and there would be nothing. I began talking to myself, arguing that it was isolation, stress, maybe carbon monoxide from the old fireplace. I found myself staring out the window for hours, scanning the green gloom for the thing I knew was there. The rational part of my mind was shutting down, replaced by a raw, animal fear that this place, this hollow, was fundamentally wrong. The culmination was a voice. It was night, and I was desperately trying to light a lamp with shaking hands. Then I heard it just outside the door. It was my grandfather's voice, clear as day, raspy and weak like in his final days. "Let me in, boy. I'm so cold out here." A wave of icy horror washed over me. I knew it wasn't him. I knew it with every fiber of my being, and yet a part of my grief-stricken brain screamed to open the door. "Please," the voice imitated, now laced with a painful sob that sounded so real. I clapped my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, tears streaming down my face, my psychological state shattering completely. I don't know what compelled me to look out the window. Perhaps my own crumbling mind needed to see the source of the torment. I peeled back the corner of the burlap curtain. It was there. A tall, impossibly thin figure, its skin a pale, sickly gray in the moonlight. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, blank expanse, yet it was tilted as if listening, and it was leaning over, its long, spindly fingers making that same tap, tap, tap on my glass pane. It stopped its tapping, and that blank face slowly turned toward the window where I stood. I stumbled back screaming and ran for the back door. I crashed through the woods blind, thorns tearing at my clothes and skin, fueled by pure, unthinking terror. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and I collapsed onto a main road where a passing sheriff's deputy found me babbling incoherently. They never found anything at the cabin. No signs of breaking, no evidence of an intruder. The official report suggests I suffered a severe psychological episode brought on by stress and isolation. But I know what I saw. I feel its gaze on me still, even in my well-lit apartment in the city. Some places are forgotten for a reason, and some things that live there learn to mimic, to lure, and to wait.
My psychiatrist, Dr. Bell, says I'm suffering from a severe form of body dysmorphia, fixated on the delusion that I am unraveling. She has me on Zyprexa, a heavy-duty antipsychotic that makes me feel disconnected from my own body, which, ironically, is the only time I feel safe. Before that trip, I was a thrill seeker, an avid hiker who loved pushing my limits. I set out to hike a remote, unmarked section of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia, a place the locals warned was prone to sudden, disorienting fog and was haunted by the ghosts of a starved mining colony from a century ago. I was arrogant. I had the best gear, a GPS, and years of experience. I thought I was prepared for anything the mountain could throw at me, but I wasn't prepared for something that didn't want to kill me, but wanted to wear me. On the second day, the mist rolled in. It was exactly as the locals described: thick, silent, and sudden. Visibility dropped to less than 5 feet. I checked my GPS. The signal was dead. The compass was spinning uselessly. I was utterly, completely lost. The silence in the fog was unnatural. It absorbed all sound, including my own panicked shouts for help. It felt like I was wrapped in a thick, wet, gray blanket. I stumbled through the woods for what felt like hours, a growing sense of dread coiling in my stomach. That's when I found the cabin. It was a dilapidated, single-room structure barely standing. It should have been a relief, a shelter from the disorienting fog. Instead, the moment I saw its dark, gaping doorway, every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to run in the other direction. My exhaustion overrode my fear. I went inside. The cabin was bare except for a single 3-legged stool and a series of crude, desperate scratch marks on the walls, tally marks arranged in groups of 7. But it was the smell that was so wrong. It didn't smell of rot and mildew. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and something else. Something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit. And it was warm. Not just out of the wind, but a palpable, living warmth, as if a large body had just left the room. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, my flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. That's when I heard the whisper. It was a dry, sibilant sound, like sand falling on paper, and it seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't a word, just a sound of profound and patient hunger. I fell into a fitful, nightmare-plagued sleep. I dreamt I was standing outside the cabin, looking in at myself. But the me inside the cabin was changing. My skin was becoming pale and translucent, stretched taut over my bones. My limbs were elongating, my fingers thinning into delicate, needle-like points. I was unraveling, my human form dissolving and reshaping into something else, something tall and white and thin. In the dream, I felt an excruciating, gnawing hunger, a starvation so deep it was in my soul. I understood that this was the fate of the miners who had died here. They hadn't just starved to death. The place itself, the hunger in the land, had remade them into something that reflected their last desperate agony. They had become physical manifestations of starvation. I awoke to the sound of scratching. It was coming from inside the cabin. My flashlight beam shot across the room to the source of the sound. There, in the corner, was a figure. It was impossibly tall and emaciated, its pale skin clinging to its bones. Its limbs were too long, its joints bent at wrong angles. It was one of them. It was crouched over my backpack, its long, spider-like fingers methodically tearing through the fabric, pulling out my rations. It wasn't looking at the food. It was looking at me. Its face was a smooth, featureless canvas, except for a wide, lipless mouth that stretched from ear to ear, a black slash of pure, unending hunger. It wasn't eating my food. It was showing me what it was. It was showing me what I was going to become. I don't remember getting out of the cabin. My next clear memory is of breaking through the fog at dawn and seeing a ranger station in the distance. I was covered in scratches, my clothes were torn, and I was babbling about a white, hungry thing in a warm cabin. They airlifted me to a hospital. Now I can't trust my own reflection. Some days I look in the mirror and I see my face starting to stretch, my fingers starting to thin. Dr. Bell says these are powerful delusions, my mind reliving the trauma. But I know it's a memory of a future that almost was. I felt that change begin in my bones in that cabin. I carry the echo of that place's hunger inside me. I am terrified of being hungry, but even more terrified of what I might become if I ever truly starve again. The thing in the mist didn't want to eat me. It wanted to recruit me.
My official diagnosis
is PTSD with severe OCD. Dr. Evans says my obsession with patterns, with checking locks and windows, is a coping mechanism. My mind is trying to impose order on a world that I now know is governed by a terrifying alien chaos. I'm on Klonopin, which keeps the worst of the panic attacks at bay. I used to be a land surveyor. My job was to impose order, to draw lines on maps, to make the wild parts of the world knowable and finite. I took a job surveying a huge, forgotten tract of land in the deepest part of the Kentucky Appalachians for a timber company. The locals called the area Whisper Creek Holler and told me to stay away, that the place was wrong. I laughed it off. I had my GPS, my maps, my science. I thought I was immune to local superstition. I learned that some places operate on a logic so ancient and twisted that our modern minds can't comprehend it without breaking. The first few days were unnerving but explainable. My GPS would fail in specific areas. My compass would spin uselessly. I kept finding strange constructions deep in the woods, tripods of woven saplings, intricate spirals of river stones, and most disturbingly, animal bones, deer, fox, even a bear that had been meticulously cleaned and arranged in complex geometric patterns. It wasn't a hunter's work, it was ritualistic, it was art, it was a message, and I felt with a growing certainty that I was the intended audience. The silence was the worst part. It was a living thing. I would be walking, and the entire forest would just go dead silent, as if every creature was hiding from something passing through. And in that silence, I always felt like I was being watched from 100 different points at once. The third night, they started interacting with my camp. I woke up to find that one of my bright orange survey flags from a mile away had been planted in the exact center of my campfire ashes. There were no footprints. Later that day, I came back from a transect to find a dead crow laid on my sleeping bag inside my zipped-up tent. Its wings were spread wide, and a perfectly smooth, white quartz pebble had been placed in its open beak. This was no longer just a feeling. It was a direct communication. Something was out there, intelligent, and it was toying with me. It was showing me that it could go wherever it wanted, that my locks and zippers were meaningless. It was establishing its dominance, reminding me that I was a guest in its house and it did not approve of my presence. I decided to pack up and leave the next morning. That night I huddled in my tent, a hunting knife in my hand, listening. Around midnight, the whistling started. It wasn't a human whistle or a bird call. It was a complex melody of clicks, whistles, and deep guttural clicks, a language of the deep woods. It came from multiple directions, a coordinated conversation happening just outside my clearing. Then I saw them, not clearly, but as fleeting, man-sized distortions in the air near the trees, like pockets of heat haze in the cold night air. They moved with a speed that was not natural, darting from shadow to shadow. I felt a terror so profound it was almost religious. I was in the presence of the local gods, the spirits of the holler, and they were deciding my fate. The nightmare I had that night was a direct message. I dreamt I was standing in the middle of a forest, but I was looking down at myself from high above. I saw my own campsite, a tiny point of light. Then I saw the land around it, etched with enormous glowing versions of the same symbols I had seen made of bones and stones. They were lines of power, a map of a world that existed on top of our own. I understood in the dream that my own survey lines were a blasphemy, an ignorant scrawl across a sacred text. I saw the shimmering figures move along these lines, and I felt their ancient, cold intelligence, their utter indifference to human life except as a curiosity or an annoyance. I was a mouse drawing lines in a lion's cage, and the lion had finally noticed me. I woke up before dawn, my heart pounding. I didn't even take down my tent. I grabbed my keys and my wallet, and I ran. The whole way back to my truck, I could hear the whistling, not angry, but almost amused. It was the sound of something that knew it had won. Now I live in a city, surrounded by concrete, but the patterns are everywhere. The cracks in the pavement, the arrangement of windows on a skyscraper, the branches of a tree in the park, they all form the symbols. Dr. Evans says it's my traumatized brain seeking patterns, but I know the truth. I saw the real map of the world for one night. I understood that we live on a thin, fragile surface, and that there are older, stranger things that walk their own paths just beneath. I am no longer ordering the world. I am just checking the locks, praying the patterns I see outside my window are only in my head.
We found the cabin by accident, my buddy Mark and I, during a hunting trip gone wrong in the Smoky Mountains. A sudden whiteout fog descended, and this place materialized out of the gloom like a mirage. It was sturdier than it had any right to be, its windows boarded up, a single padlock on the door that was so rusted it broke with one hit from the butt of my rifle. The inside was sparse, a single room with a wood stove, a chair, and a crude bed frame. But it was dry, and it was shelter. We thought we were lucky. That feeling lasted until morning, when Mark woke me, his face pale. "Dude," he whispered, pointing to the wood stove, "did you do that?" Sitting perfectly centered on the cold iron was a single dead crow, its neck clearly broken. We laughed it off, nervously. A prank, a weird coincidence. Maybe it fell down the chimney. But the next day, after scouting for a way out, we returned to find the chair moved. It was now sitting directly in the center of the room, facing the door. The air grew cold. "This isn't funny, man," Mark said, his voice tight. I swore I hadn't touched it. We argued, the first fissures of paranoia cracking our friendship. That night, we heard footsteps on the porch, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. We grabbed our rifles, shouting challenges into the darkness. Our voices echoed back at us, but the footsteps just kept circling, a relentless, patient rhythm that went on for hours until dawn. By the third day, we were prisoners, too terrified to leave the perceived safety of the walls. The fog never lifted, our food was low, and the silence between us was heavier than the fog outside. Mark started talking to himself, his eyes darting towards the corners of the room. I found him staring at the boarded-up window, muttering about someone peeking in. I saw nothing but darkness between the cracks in the wood. Then things started disappearing. First, my knife, then the batteries from our flashlights. We accused each other. Our whispers turned into frantic shouts. We were no longer afraid of something outside. We were afraid of each other, our minds twisting in the isolation. The climax came on the fourth night. I woke up to the sound of the wood stove door clanging shut. Mark was standing over it, his back to me. "Mark?" I said. He turned around slowly. In his hands was my missing knife, and his eyes were wide with a terror I'll never forget. "It told me to make sure you stay quiet," he whispered, but his voice was all wrong, a low, guttural imitation. He took a step toward me. I didn't see my friend anymore. I saw a puppet, his strings pulled by the oppressive malice of that cabin. I scrambled back, grabbing my rifle, not to shoot him, but to smash the window and escape the nightmare he'd become. I leapt through the broken glass, not feeling the cuts, and ran blindly into the fog. I heard him behind me, not shouting my name, but making that same wet, guttural sound.
I hid for hours, listening to him crash through the woods, calling in that horrible voice. The sounds eventually faded. A rescue team found me 2 days later, half frozen and incoherent. They found Mark a mile away, curled up in a hollow log. He was alive, but he hasn't spoken a word since. He just stares, vacant. The official report says exposure and shared psychosis. I know the truth. That cabin wasn't empty. It had a tenant, and it wanted to play. It used my best friend against me, and it broke him in a way I fear is permanent.
I was an architecture student, drawn to the Appalachians to document the construction of old pioneer cabins. I'd heard rumors of one deep in a North Carolina gorge, a place supposedly built with a method lost to time. When I finally found it, after a brutal 8-hour hike, it took my breath away. It was perfect. The notching was precise, the angles sharp, defying a century of weather. I set up my camera and tripod inside, the single room feeling more like a museum than a ruin. It was silent, save for the wind. I started taking measurements, but my numbers weren't adding up. The interior dimensions were a full foot shorter than the exterior suggested. My professional curiosity turned to a low, throbbing dread. The math was impossible. I decided to spend the night to get a full day of study. As the sun set, I noticed the first change. The doorway I come through seemed narrower. I chalked it up to the fading light. I reviewed the photos on my camera, and a chill went down my spine. In one picture, the far wall looked different. The logs were arranged in a subtly different pattern. I told myself it was a lens distortion, a glitch. I was a man of science, of measurements. I refused to believe what my eyes were showing me. I started taking more pictures, frantic now, a record to prove to myself that I was still sane. But with each flash, the room in the photo looked slightly more wrong than the one I was standing in. The door was gone. Not boarded up or disappeared, but the wall was seamless, as if it had never existed. I screamed, running my hands over the rough logs where the exit should have been. Panic seized me. I grabbed my tripod, smashing it against the wall until the wood splintered, but behind the first layer was just another layer of logs. The windows were gone too. I was sealed in a perfect wooden box. My mind, trained to understand space and structure, shattered. I was trapped in illogical impossibility. The air began to feel thin, used. I hyperventilated, sliding down the wall, sobbing. This wasn't haunted, it was all wrong. The cabin was a living, changing prison. Then the writing appeared. It started as faint lines in the dust on the floor, then deepened into grooves as if an invisible hand was carving into the wood. It wasn't a language I knew. Sharp, angular symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. They spread up the walls, moving, rearranging themselves. The room itself felt like it was shrinking, the ceiling lowering imperceptibly. I could feel the pressure, not just in the room, but in my mind, as if the geometry of my own thoughts was being rewritten. I was no longer an architect in a cabin. I was a specimen in a cage, being studied by something that communicated in impossible physics and shifting dimensions. I don't know how I got out. There was a sound like tearing fabric, and a sliver of moonlight appeared in a corner. I didn't question it. I clawed at the opening, squeezing through a gap that should not have fit me. I ran and never looked back. I abandoned thousands of dollars of equipment. When I finally made it to town, I was a wreck. I tried to show people the pictures on my camera's memory card. Every single photo was blank. The doctors say I suffered a massive psychotic break, likely from dehydration and isolation, my brain creating a complex delusion to explain my predicament. But they can't explain the deep, angular scars on my fingertips from clawing at the walls. They can't explain why I now get panic attacks in small rooms, or why I sometimes wake up in the night, certain the walls in my apartment are just a little bit closer together than they were before.
My doctor says I have a severe form of obsessive-compulsive disorder, triggered by the grief of my great-aunt's passing. He claims my compulsion to meticulously arrange and photograph everything in my apartment is an attempt to exert control after a traumatic event. He has me on a high dose of Luvox. He's a good man, but he's wrong. My compulsion isn't about control, it's about proof. It's about documenting reality so that I have evidence when it decides to change. I learned that lesson in a small, forgotten cabin in the Appalachian foothills of Virginia. My great-aunt left me a small parcel of land in her will. My only task was to clean out the old one-room hunting cabin her husband had built in the 1950s. I went there expecting a weekend of dusty, sentimental work. I left with the horrifying knowledge that some places are caught in a memory loop, and they will violently resist any attempt to change their past. The cabin was a time capsule. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but it was all just as my great-uncle had left it 40 years ago. A rocking chair by the cold hearth, a tin cup on a nail by the door, a worn Bible on the bedside table, open to the 23rd Psalm. I spent the first day carefully packing away his personal effects into boxes. I moved the rocking chair to the center of the room to make space, placed the tin cup in a box, and closed the dusty Bible. It was hard, emotional work. As evening fell, a deep, heavy silence descended on the surrounding woods. I locked the cabin door from the inside, a modern padlock I had brought with me, and settled into my sleeping bag, feeling a sense of accomplishment and closure. I woke up in the middle of the night to a faint, rhythmic creaking. Creak, croak, creak, croak. My heart pounded in my chest. I slowly sat up and aimed my flashlight beam across the room. I nearly screamed. The rocking chair was no longer in the center of the room where I had left it. It was back by the hearth, rocking slowly back and forth in the dead, still air as if someone had just gotten up from it. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, my mind racing. I checked the door. My padlock was still secure. No windows were broken. It was impossible. Then I saw it. The tin cup was back on its nail by the door, and the Bible on the nightstand, which I had closed and placed in a box, was back on the table, open once again to the 23rd Psalm. Nothing had been stolen or vandalized. It had been reset. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, clutching a tire iron, listening to the gentle, mocking rock of the empty chair. The moment the sun rose, I documented everything. I took pictures with my phone, noting the exact position of every object. Then, as a test, I moved everything again, deliberately placing the rocking chair upside down, putting the Bible under the cot. I left the cabin, locking it behind me, and sat on a stump outside for hours, watching. Nothing happened. Convinced I had suffered a waking dream or a hallucination, I went back inside. The instant I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange, dizzying sensation, like a sudden drop in air pressure. The air grew cold, and the light from the windows seemed to dim. When my eyes adjusted, my blood ran cold. Everything was back in its original position. The chair was upright by the hearth. The Bible was open on the table. The cabin had reset itself right in front of my eyes. The nightmare I have is always the same. I'm in the cabin, but it's no longer dusty and abandoned. It's clean, warm. A fire is roaring in the hearth. My great-uncle is sitting in the rocking chair, his back to me, softly humming a tune I don't recognize. I can smell his pipe tobacco. I try to speak to him, to call his name, but I have no voice. I'm an invisible, impotent observer.
He never turns around. He just keeps rocking and humming. The horror of the dream is the crushing feeling of being a ghost in someone else's memory, a memory that is so powerful it has become the permanent reality of that place. I always wake up just as he reaches for the tin cup. The smell of his pipe tobacco so strong it feels like it's choking me. I never went back. I called a lawyer and sold the land for a pittance, sight unseen. Now, I live in a state of constant vigilance. Every morning, I photograph my apartment. The position of the chairs, the books on the shelf, the mug by the sink. I check these photos throughout the day. Dr. Evans says this is my illness, my OCD, but I know it's my defense system. I saw reality itself bend to the will of a memory, to the stubborn ghost of a daily routine. I learned that the past is not always dead, and some places will fight you to the death to keep from being changed. I am not trying to control my world. I am just trying to make sure the world I fell asleep in is the same one I wake up in.
My psychiatrist, Dr. Sharma, says I suffer from a form of PTSD linked to spatial disorientation. She believes the stress of being a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains, combined with a brief period of getting lost, caused a psychotic break. She has me on propranolol to keep the panic attacks from feeling like heart attacks. But I wasn't lost. I knew that valley like the back of my hand. I had hiked every ridge, mapped every stream. I was the one who knew the terrain. The problem wasn't that I was lost. The problem was that the terrain itself became a lie. Before that day, I believed in maps, in compasses, in the solid, dependable reality of the earth beneath my feet. Now, I'm afraid to cross an open field because I know that fixed points are a comforting illusion and that some places in those ancient woods don't obey the rules of geography. They move, they hunt, and they show you things that are meant to break your mind. It was a routine patrol in a remote section of the park known as Hemlock Hollow. I was checking for illegal snares and campsites. I came over a familiar ridge, and my heart stopped. Down in the valley, where there should have been nothing but a dense stand of old-growth poplar, there was a cabin. It wasn't on any of my maps, modern or archival. It was a small, single-room structure made of dark, weathered logs with a sagging porch and a stone chimney that looked like a crooked tooth. It looked like it had been there for 100 years, yet it had appeared overnight. My rational mind fought for an explanation. I'd taken a wrong turn, my memory was failing. But I knew this valley. I checked my GPS, my topographical map. I was exactly where I thought I was. The cabin was simply not supposed to be there. It was an error in the code of the world, and every instinct I had screamed that to approach it was to step outside of reality itself. Against my better judgment, my duty as a ranger compelled me to investigate. I approached with caution, my hand on my sidearm. The air grew cold and still around the structure. There were no footprints, no signs of life. The door creaked open under my touch. Inside the cabin was a portrait of ancient decay. Thick, undisturbed dust covered everything. A rusted wood stove, a broken cot, a single chair. It looked like no one had set foot in there for a century. But on a small, dusty table in the center of the room sat a single object, a small, hand-carved wooden bird, its paint still vibrant, its surface smooth and free of any dust. It was impossible. It looked like it had been placed there just minutes ago. I felt a profound sense of violation, a feeling that I was being watched by whatever had left it. I backed out slowly. The image of that impossible, perfect little bird burned into my vision. I hiked out of the hollow, my mind reeling. I filed a report about an unmapped structure, feeling like a madman.
My supervisor told me to lead a team back the next day to document it. I spent a sleepless night, the image of the cabin a dark blot in my mind. When we returned that next morning, it was gone. Not collapsed, not burned down. It had vanished. The dense stand of poplar trees was exactly where it should have been. There was no clearing, no foundation stones, no trace that anything had ever stood there. My team looked at me with a mixture of pity and concern. They spent hours searching the area. They found nothing. It was in that moment that my mind began to fracture. It wasn't the appearance of the cabin that broke me. It was the disappearance. It was the calm, absolute denial of its own existence, leaving me as the sole insane witness to an event that geology and logic said could never have happened. The nightmares started that week and have never stopped. In them, I'm always trapped inside the moving cabin. I look out its single, grimy window, and the forest is a blur of greens and browns, the trees flowing past like water. The cabin is moving through the woods like a boat on a river, silent and relentless. I can't get out. The door has no handle on the inside. I am being taken somewhere. The wooden bird is in my hand, and I can feel a faint, warm pulse coming from it, like a tiny heart. In the dream, I know that the cabin isn't the predator. It's the lure. It's the bait used by whatever is truly hunting in those woods. I always wake up just as the cabin comes to a stop in a dark, unfamiliar hollow, the pulsing in the bird growing stronger, and I hear a soft, scratching sound begin on the outside of the door. I couldn't be a ranger anymore. How can you patrol a forest when you can't trust the ground you're walking on? Dr. Sharma says my agoraphobia is a result of feeling unsafe and exposed. But it's more specific than that. I'm afraid of open spaces because I know that they can lie. I spend my days now in my small apartment, surrounded by maps, pinning my location, constantly reassuring myself that the world is stable. But sometimes, when I'm not looking, I feel like the furniture in my room has shifted ever so slightly. I live with the constant growing fear that one day I'll wake up and find that small, perfectly carved wooden bird sitting on my nightstand, a silent message that the hunt is not over.
My map was a useless, rain-smudged piece of paper, leading me nowhere but deeper into the suffocating green of the West Virginia backcountry. I was on a solo hiking trip, a misguided attempt to clear my head after the divorce, but all I found was disorientation and a creeping, primal fear. That's when I saw it, a small, one-room cabin slumped against the side of a hill, its roof sagging like a broken spine. It looked ancient, forgotten by time, and yet, as I approached, the air grew still and heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The door was slightly ajar, an invitation that felt less like a welcome and more like a trap. My rational mind screamed to turn back, but a deeper, more desperate part of me saw potential shelter from the coming storm. The inside was a tomb of dust and shadows, frozen in a moment decades past. A rusted iron bed frame, a collapsed table, and a stone fireplace filled with ashes that looked disturbingly fresh. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something sweet and rotten like old meat. I decided to stay, just for the night, barricading the door with the broken table. As darkness fell, so did the temperature. I started a small fire for comfort, its light dancing on the log walls. That's when I noticed the first inconsistency. The gaps between the logs seemed to be pulsing, contracting and expanding with a slow, rhythmic motion, like the cabin was breathing. I told myself it was the firelight playing tricks on my tired, stressed-out mind.
Sleep was impossible. The breathing of the walls was a soft, constant whisper underneath the sound of the wind. Then the sounds began, a faint, wet scratching coming from under the bed. My heart hammered against my ribs. "It's an animal," I whispered into the darkness, trying to anchor myself in logic. "Just a possum, a raccoon." But the scratching changed into a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the dirt floor beneath the floorboards. I shone my flashlight under the bed, but there was only packed earth. The dragging stopped, replaced by a low, wet gurgle that seemed to come from every direction at once. I pressed my hands over my ears, rocking back and forth, feeling my sanity begin to slip its fragile moorings. The worst was the voice. It was a harsh, phlegmy voice that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It didn't form words, just sounds, but I felt its intent, a malevolent curiosity. I screamed for it to stop, my voice cracking with hysteria I didn't recognize. In response, the entire cabin let out a deep, shuddering sigh. The fire suddenly snuffed out, plunging me into absolute blackness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. In the oppressive silence, I heard a new sound, the slow creaking strain of the roof beams above me, bending downward as if a tremendous weight was pressing down on the entire structure, trying to crush me inside my own skull. I lost all sense of reason. I tore at the barricade I'd built, my nails splintering on the old wood, fueled by a pure animalistic need to escape. I burst out into the cold night, stumbling and falling down the rocky incline, not caring about the branches that lashed at my face. I didn't look back. I ran until the sun came up, until I collapsed on a remote fire road. They found me days later, dehydrated and babbling about living cabins and whispering walls. The search party found no cabin where I described, just an overgrown foundation stone and the silent, watching trees.
My diagnosis is a cocktail of severe claustrophobia and paranoid schizophrenia. Dr. Lee has me on an antipsychotic that's supposed to stop the architectural hallucinations, as he calls them. He believes a traumatic experience of being lost in the woods with my friend Mark caused a psychotic break where I perceived our surroundings as hostile and mutable. But Mark saw it too. They just called his version folie à deux, a shared delusion. We went into the West Virginia backcountry looking for an abandoned mining settlement from the early 1900s, a ghost town called Hemlock Ridge. We found one of its cabins, and what we experienced inside taught me that some structures aren't just empty spaces. They are predators. They have their own anatomy, and they can change it at will to trap you. From the outside, it looked like any other decaying prospector's cabin, a single-room log structure with a small porch, a door, and 2 grimy windows on the front wall. We were excited, thinking we had found the heart of the settlement. We pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was immediately, inexplicably wrong. The first thing we noticed was the lack of windows. The 2 windows we had seen from the outside were simply not there on the inside walls. The walls were solid, windowless planks of wood. We both felt a dizzying wave of vertigo. We backed out and looked at the front of the cabin again. 2 windows, clear as day. We went back inside, solid walls. It was a physical impossibility, a paradox of architecture that made our brains ache. It was a magic trick with the most sinister of intentions. Against our better judgment, we decided to explore the interior, drawn in by the sheer wrongness of it all. The cabin was larger on the inside than it appeared from the outside, the back wall seeming to recede into the gloom. We found strange personal items that looked recent, a half-eaten can of beans on a table, a still-warm blanket on a cot, a single lantern hanging from a beam that cast a weak, flickering light even though it had no visible fuel source.
The air was thick with a smell of wet wool and something metallic, like old blood. Then we heard it, a heavy, rhythmic thumping. Thump, 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 coming from above us. It was the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in a loft. But there was no loft. The ceiling was just a single layer of flat wooden beams. Something was walking on a floor that did not exist. That's when the real horror began. Mark and I decided to leave, but when we turned back to the door, the wall was different. There was no door. The wall where the entrance had been was now a seamless, solid expanse of logs, identical to the others. Panic, cold and absolute, seized us. We were trapped. We started pounding on the walls, screaming, our voices swallowed by the oppressive silence of the cabin. The methodical thumping from the non-existent loft above us stopped. A moment later, we heard a new sound. A slow, deliberate scraping coming from the other side of the interior wall, the sound of something heavy being dragged. The cabin was no longer a static structure. It was a living organism, and it was rearranging its own insides to better digest us. My nightmare is not a dream of monsters, but of architecture. I am always in a house that is constantly changing. Hallways stretch into infinity, doors open into brick walls, and rooms fold in on themselves like cardboard boxes. I'm always trying to get out, but the house is a living labyrinth designed by a malevolent intelligence. The worst part of the dream is the feeling of being observed, not by a person, but by the house itself. I can feel its cold, calculating awareness in the grain of the wood, in the angle of the corners. It is watching me, studying my panic, enjoying my futile attempts to escape its impossible geometry. I always wake up in a cold sweat, clawing at the walls of my own safe, familiar bedroom, my heart convinced that the door will no longer be there. Mark managed to break through a section of the wall with a loose log he found inside, and we scrambled out into the twilight, bleeding and hysterical. When we looked back, the cabin was just a cabin again, a small single room with a door and 2 windows, looking perfectly normal, almost innocent. We ran and didn't stop until we hit a road. Now I am terrified of being indoors. Dr. Lee says my mind is replaying the trauma of being lost. But he wasn't there. He didn't see a door vanish before his eyes. He didn't hear footsteps coming from a floor that did not exist. I know the truth. Some places are hungry. We stumbled into a hunter's blind, a place designed to look like a sanctuary from the outside, but from the inside, it is nothing but a stomach, and its walls are its teeth.